I was an ordinary office drone, shuffling between endless meetings, coffee breaks that felt more like lifelines, and the humdrum rhythm of spreadsheets and client calls. Most evenings, I would retreat to my small apartment, where the silence was broken only by the flicker of my TV. I spent weekends daydreaming about vacations I could barely afford, scrolling through travel blogs, and texting my sister about plans we never seemed to make. My greatest worry was the next email I had to send. Life was predictable and, honestly, uninspiring. I thought it would stay that way forever. But everything changed the morning. Rumors of a widespread meltdown began swirling. At first, it felt distant, like one of those sensational news stories that never really touched your life. Government officials spoke in vague terms about containment failures, but no one seemed to know the full story. It was just chatter on social media, a headline here or there. Until it wasn't. By the time I realized how serious it was, the city was already breaking down around me. Streets that were once bustling with commuters now teemed with confusion. Office workers sprinted past in panic, their briefcases forgotten, while shopkeepers hastily pulled down shutters, locking themselves inside. The hum of traffic had been replaced by the shriek of car alarms and the distant wail of emergency sirens. Pedestrians clustered around radios in store windows, their faces pale as they strained to hear garbled broadcasts. I could see desperation in their eyes, a dawning realization that whatever was happening wasn't going to end soon. I remember hearing the first panicked screams echoing through the concrete canyons outside my office window. It was surreal, like the city itself had decided to collapse all at once. I stood there, frozen, watching the chaos unfold below as people fled in every direction. That was the last moment I felt like a bystander. Everything after that was survival. The first real hint of the outbreak came through a news broadcast. Someone had turned the TV on in the break room, and a small group of us gathered around. The footage showed violent outbreaks in neighboring districts. People were collapsing in the streets, clutching their throats as if suffocating. Moments later, they would convulse violently before going still. Then, with an eerie suddenness, they rose, their movements jerky yet purposeful, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. I noticed dark, pulsating veins crawling up their necks and arms, their bloodshot eyes filled with a vacant, hungry stare. Some lunged at the nearest person, while others let out guttural groans that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't clear how the infection spread, but the speed at which it consumed entire blocks was terrifying. Crowds scattered in every direction, but it was as if no one could outrun it. Their eyes were bloodshot, their movements jerky but disturbingly purposeful. My gut twisted as I pulled out my phone to call my family. No one picked up. That was the moment it hit me. Life as I knew it was over. The building's fire alarms blared soon after, their piercing shriek cutting through the already tense air. The sound was relentless, echoing off the walls and rattling nerves. People darted out of their offices in confusion, some clutching their ears, others shouting over the noise to be heard. The flashing strobe lights made the hallways feel like a disorienting maze. I could see panic in their eyes, a collective sense that this wasn't just another drill. Every second the alarms screamed, the sense of urgency grew stronger, pushing us toward the exits. Rumors spread that infected crowds were swarming nearby streets. Half the staff rushed to the exits, their faces pale with fear, the other half stayed, paralyzed by indecision. I joined a small group of coworkers, people I barely knew but suddenly trusted more than anyone else. We decided to head for the parking garage. My hands trembled so much I dropped my key fob. Fear and adrenaline buzzed through me, numbing my thoughts. The only goal was to get out. To run. But the streets were a nightmare. Cars clogged every intersection, some abandoned, others still running with their doors flung open. The acrid stench of gasoline and burnt rubber hung in the air, mixing with the faint metallic tang of blood. Sirens wailed sporadically in the distance, cutting through the eerie silence that would settle between bursts of chaos. Papers and trash fluttered across the asphalt like ghosts of a city that once thrived. I passed a minivan with its windows shattered, A child's toy lying forgotten on the ground beside it. The faint sound of muffled sobbing echoed from somewhere, a reminder that not everyone had managed to escape the carnage. Smoke billowed from somewhere in the distance, and the air was thick with the acrid stench of burning rubber. Entire blocks were already quarantined behind hastily erected barricades. Military vehicles rumbled past, soldiers shouting orders I couldn't make out. Every detour led us closer to the chaos. I felt panic rising in my chest, like a balloon about to burst. There was no clear way out. Forward or backward, every direction seemed like a trap. Then we saw them. The infected. Whispers from earlier reports had hinted at a pathogen, something that emerged from contaminated water supplies or perhaps a lab accident. The truth was never clear. What we did know was that it acted fast, spreading through bites or close contact, turning its victims into something unrecognizable within minutes. Seeing them up close was worse than any report could prepare us for. They stumbled into view as we navigated a narrow side street, moaning and lunging at anything that moved. Their skin was pale and feverish, veins dark like a web of ink under their flesh. For a moment, I froze, caught between the instinct to run and the urge to protect those with me. It was one thing to see them on a screen, it was another to face them in person. The stench of decay hit me like a wall, and my stomach churned. We managed to slip past, but the encounter left me shaken. I knew we wouldn't be so lucky next time. We found a barricaded shop a few blocks later. Survivors inside begged us to let them out or at least share supplies. They were low on food and water, their voices hoarse from shouting. But letting them join us meant a bigger, slower group, a liability we couldn't afford. I wrestled with guilt as we shared what little we had and gave them vague directions to a rumored safe zone. Their faces haunted me as we walked away, their pleas ringing in my ears. It felt heartless, but what choice did we have? Night fell, and we took shelter in an abandoned school. A few teachers and students had already turned it into a makeshift fortress, blocking doors with desks and chairs. They let us in, but cautiously, their eyes darting between us as if we might turn at any moment. Exhaustion hit me like a freight train. I collapsed in a corner, too tired to think, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying the day's horrors. For the first time since it started, I felt a sliver of relief, fleeting and fragile. The school wasn't the sanctuary it seemed. Conflicting personalities emerged quickly, tensions simmering beneath the surface. One man, a former businessman, insisted on strict rationing and demanded everyone turn over their supplies for centralized control. Meanwhile, a young teacher argued passionately for immediate action, organizing scavenging parties to gather resources before it was too late. Rumors didn't help. Whispers spread that one of the newcomers might be infected, leading to heated accusations and frantic attempts to examine minor injuries. Each argument chipped away at the fragile sense of unity, and I could feel the group teetering on the edge of complete fracture. Some demanded strict rationing, others wanted to search for help. Rumors spread like wildfire, infected hidden among us, plans to raid nearby stores. Trust was scarce. I tried to stay neutral, but the stress was unbearable. Survival wasn't just about fighting the infected, it was about managing human fear and desperation. Every argument felt like a crack in the fragile shelter we'd built. Communication broke down completely the next day. Our cell phones had no service, and the emergency broadcast stopped. The silence was suffocating. A single battery-powered radio occasionally crackled with static and half-words of distress. I grieved for the world I'd known, remembering how I used to complain about spam calls. Now I'd give anything to hear another voice. The isolation was like a weight on my chest, growing heavier with each passing hour. The breaking point came that night. A group of armed strangers broke into the school, claiming they were there to rescue us. Their intentions quickly turned hostile. Whether they were looters or just desperate, they left a trail of broken doors and shattered trust. We fought them off with makeshift weapons, baseball bats, broken chairs, but the encounter left me shaken to my core. Adrenaline carried me through, but afterward, I couldn't stop trembling. It was a grim reminder that the infected weren't our only threat. The next day, the infected closed in around the school in greater numbers. Our fortifications buckled under the pressure. Desperation took hold, and we had no choice but to flee. The night was a blur of chaos, screams, shadows, and the ever-present fear of being caught. Some among us vanished, swallowed by the darkness or the horde. Every alley felt like a trap, every step a gamble. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when survival was so close. After hours of dangerous travel, we finally reached the rumored safe zone. It was a makeshift camp in an old stadium, its entrances illuminated by floodlights. Military vehicles lined the perimeter, and uniformed soldiers organized desperate civilians. Relief washed over me as I collapsed against the gates, exhausted, bruised, and forever changed. I had lived through the worst moments of my life, and yet, I knew the fight wasn't over. The stadium offered temporary safety, but it wasn't the salvation I'd hoped for. Resources were scarce, and the threat of infection lingered like a shadow over everything. The world outside was still crumbling, and rebuilding society felt like an impossible dream. But as I sat there, watching the sunrise over the tattered remains of the city, I made a promise to myself. I would protect those I cared about, no matter the cost. The world might rebuild, or it might crumble further. Either way, I intended to keep going. One step at a time.